Have you seen the news yet? Karras shook his head, and stood to come and see the monitor, and stretching luxuriously as he did so. He could feel a number of stiff vertebrae in his spine crack, and he grimaced at the pain but smiled, knowing that small discomforts would mean much less pain later from the build-up of pressure in his joints. It had been a stretch he had taken an entire year to perfect some centuries ago, and he had surprised even himself with how quickly he had picked it up and managed to perfect the action with little to no wasted movement or exertion. His spine followed mathematically beautiful ratios before he finished the stretch, coming to stand behind his mate and look at the boxy monitor. Kelsey pointed to part of the flickering screen, and he could see that the article was a news piece about the newly discovered humans. He was surprised that they had gained so much noteworthiness, for they were some of the unfortunate species of sentience cursed with mortality. They were little more than furless bipedal mammals, scarcely evolved beyond lactating, hooting at each other, and fighting in the mud with pointed sticks. In fact, their entire genus hadn't even existed for a clean million years as of the current date, whereas Kelsey and Karras' kind could actually count their ancestors back to the formation and calling of their planet nearly 10 billion years ago. With some amusement, Karras saw that he was nearly as old as the very planet humans called home, their star being a late bloomer in the celestial sense, and everything following being likewise delayed. Indeed, he almost felt a degree of pity for the simple creatures. Such limited lifespans were mere fractions of a blink of a cosmic eye. The scant handfuls of other sentient species and civilizations that litter the universe, of course, varied significantly in their form, function, and longevity, but even the most fleeting of those that Karras had heard of at least counted their lifespans in dozens of centuries. The humans, however, were a mere fraction of that, and it surprised Karras to no end that they had made a civilization at all, let alone achieve spaceflight and interstellar travel. There had even been some murmurings here and there by those who had met the humans and seen some of their culture, that their species was capable of producing not just quality goods, but quality art as well. The notion was patently ridiculous, of course. The development of talent, true talent, took dozens of centuries for even the most menial and trivial passion, to say nothing of more noble and historic works like carving, textiles, or painting. The thought reminded him. Karras stepped over to his latest carving and worked on it for a few days to clear his head before further trying to understand what he was reading. Pondering the article Kelsey had opened, he could see that it spoke of humans in not just a curious tone, but in one filled with frustration and anger. Evidently, the humans had colonized a series of empty planetoids that had been identified as being rich in some much-needed minerals for starship hyperjump shielding. Unfortunately, the humans were unwilling to see reason, claiming that because they had landed on, lived, and reproduced on the surface for a mere millennium, they were entitled to set terms for any negotiations regarding what lay poorly utilized and unappreciated below their feet. Kelsey returned from the reading of her Arboretum that evening, seeing Karras still reading though, and chuckled. "Yes, I'm personally coming to the conclusion that we may have been overly hasty in asking for their input at all," she said, pointing to a sentence a few paragraphs down that Karras had not reached yet. "They seem to recognize and appreciate the density of titanium, but claim they have no need for it for jump shielding." Karras blinked, stunned for a moment before he burst out laughing. "Evidently they have some desire to put a dent in that seemingly boundless well of reproductive capacity," he said. "The radiation from one trip alone would surely sterilize any of the dumb bipeds, to say nothing of the various cancers they will be inviting upon their heads after a few additional trips." Kelsey shrugged, blinking at the rising binary suns in her eyes. "Yes, well, I guess they see life as more expendable than even we would have guessed," she said, as she picked a sprouting clump of soil out from under her claw. "The last bits of the report indicate the humans have threatened combat should we continue with hostilities, but their ships are something built in apparently not even a full human lifetime. The battles will likely be more a matter of swatting some belligerent gnats than a true competition." Karis nodded, turning back to begin truly focusing on his carving. He has spent nearly 1,000,000 years honing his skills on this art form, and was barely a score of millennia outside of his apprenticeship classes, but he still believed he had some minor improvements to go before perfecting his art to stand amongst the masters of carving among his kind. Karis had worked with this particular block of soapstone for nearly a decade already, here and there carving in and out, but he believed he had finally begun to achieve the final stages of details, as its avian form became more recognizable. Although he was not finished yet, the piece was a constant source of praise for his efforts from all who visited. True, it might not be up to the level of the oldest masters at this point, but it was at least recognized as being among the best of the dozen or so other living sculptors across their species, an annoyingly crowded field due to its popularity. He lifted his chisel, and, over the course of the day, gently scraped off another flake. He had barely been carving at it for another year before Cowsey's computer let out an insistent beep, alerting her that the digital courier had arrived with a news update. Both Karis and his mate were surprised at another news release so soon, but he could already feel shock rippling through him as his eyes took in the headline and the ominous map beneath it. Humans strike back after mining rig defense, inflict heavy casualties on both personnel and holdings. Long days passed as they stood in shock. Karis could feel his anxiety rising. Death was a rare and celebrated thing for his species, with lives cut short prematurely due to accidents or violence mourned to the utmost. And yet here were the names of hundreds of lives lost, enough to depopulate entire planets, all just because some lowly humans had decided not to cooperate. It was stunning to see as well the map revealing the holdings the humans had taken, springing forward like a wildfire from a few mere arms of their home galaxy to now nearly half a dozen galaxies, almost all of which shared a border with Karis's people. It was a surprise move to be sure, but Karis felt only a small pang of anxiety threatened to creep over him as he looked to find where on the maps of the contested galaxies the world beneath their feet lay. Theirs was a fairly urbanized world. There were more than a dozen families on this continent, and twice that number scattered amongst the large islands in the planet's ocean. However, it did lie on the far tip of a galaxy that itself was nestled tens of thousands of light years away from the contested border. "I expect they'll soon get what's coming to them," Cowsey said with a derisive snort. "They have no doubt mobilized the fleet, and will soon be showing those humans why slapdash shipbuilding in less than a century is a great way to waste resources and lives alike." Karis nodded, but couldn't help but wonder what the humans might do if they were not brought to heel quickly. The next week he awoke from a fitful sleep and began returning to his carving to try to steady his mind. He began to imagine that all was well after a month passed, and then another. But at the beginning of the third, there was another chime that made him and Cowsey jump at their midday meal. Cautiously, she opened the message to find a text-only warning from the provisional government of their small world, a household of bureaucrats and number counters who lived just a few hundred kilometers from where Karis currently sat. It had been nearly 1,000 years since they had last needed to send any messages, but this time their eyes were wide and panicked as they called. "The humans have reached our galaxy," one voice said, gesturing to the updated map. To Karis's concern, the humans were showing as holding a trio of worlds and a pair of systems across the opposite side of the disk of this galaxy. It was hundreds of light years distant, but given the speed at which they had spread before, this likely meant they were mere seasons away. Even so, Karis was terrified. Scarcely a month passed before the warning chime sounded. For the first time, he had heard it outside of a systems test. He walked over to where Cowsey sat, similarly dumbstruck at the computer console. The fuzzy green text on the screen indicated that the automated weapons platforms that protected their world, like so many others, had been engaged. They had detected incoming human craft, those blisteringly fast. A few minutes later, it opened fire upon them. But to their shock and dismay, the weapons platform stopped sending telemetry data less than a quarter of an hour later, suggesting complete destruction at the humans' hands in as much time as it took to say the words. He stepped to the front entrance of their home and looked up. Fire arced through the sky, likely the last few defense platforms being shot down by the human fleet. As for the human ships, they were nearly too fast to see, streaks racing across hundreds of clicks per hour. He barely had time to shout Cowsey a brief, fearful look, when there was a sudden rumble and rush of wind and movement. Blinking, still in shock, he saw that one of the human craft had landed. They were the only ones on the kilometers-long street, as was the norm, so he knew they had come for Cowsey and him. Karras braced himself for the end, feeling sorrow well up within his heart, and the knowledge that he would have his immortality cut short at such an early age. An hour passed. Opening an eye cautiously, however, there was no pain, no darkness, no death. Instead, a pair of knee-high humans were standing on their doorstep. They seemed to almost vibrate or phase between poses, but mostly held the same static, curious pose of looking up at them. Karras became aware of a whining buzz in his ears, and after a moment it grew longer and then fell quiet again. Karras just stared, glanced to see if Cowsey stirred, unsure what these humans wanted. The third time the buzz now was much more like a low hum, and he realized he could make out a voice speaking very quickly, too quickly for him to make out the words. Cautiously he asked, "Are you humans? Is someone making this noise?" There was another blur of movement, the humans' torsos snapping to face each other, and their arms moving so fast they blurred. Then they returned to the previous pose. This time the voice coming through was clearly artificial but understandable. "Hello there. We are humanity, and we come in peace." Karras felt notably more at ease at the latter half of their diminutive statement, but he was still apprehensive. "Well, if you remain peaceful, you are welcome to enter, I suppose." The words scarcely left his lips when the humans abruptly vanished in a blur. High-pitched whines and buzzes echoed from random corners of the room. He could see the streaks of movement from the humans seemingly ricocheting around the inside of their home. He suddenly felt a regret at having been perhaps too hasty, but before he could speak, the humans had appeared again in front of him, their limbs and heads still showing that same oddly stuttering and ghost-like blur of movement, too fast for the eye to follow. "We thank you for your hospitality," they said again in the artificial voice. "We've been going from colony to colony to try to help correct some miscommunications and misconceptions, but we realize that it may appear startling." Karras just nodded. The flashing, sudden encroachment of humans, and the news reports fresh in his mind before speaking. "Well, that is good to hear. But I know there are many of my people, myself and my mate included, who feel strongly and sadly about how many lives have been lost in conflict with your species." The humans abruptly turned, and there was a loud spate of the high-pitched buzz, including an odd chittering noise, before they turned back to Karras and made a gesture of apology. "I understand. True, there have been lives lost that could have been avoided, but it appears that your reports warn of hundreds dead, when I believe the last count was currently 11 total." Karras blinked again, a momentary silence passing before he stammered out. "That is good news indeed, but why did they think them dead then?" The humans looked to each other before turning back to the alien looming over them. "It is customary for our military leaders to disrupt enemy communications. Typically, such a communications blackout is fairly temporary, but that assumes a higher level of skill for counter-hacking. It appears that was an overestimation on our part, for which we apologize. I've already sent communications off to our command to inform them of this, and request that the blackout be lifted." Karras was about to reiterate his thanks, when the human blurred and appeared beside his carving. "Wonderful work. This is yours, I take it," the human said, and through the quick gesture Karras could see the human's head pointed toward the carving tools he held at his lowest set of manipulator limbs. He nodded. "It is. Were it not for a few blemishes here and there, it might be one of the finest carvings of my generation." The human nodded. "It is beautiful. Reminds me of a sculptor from my own homeworld." The alien nodded politely, but within, Karras was somewhat annoyed by the comparison. The oldest a human could achieve was scarcely past 100 years until very recently, and even then, a century and a half was still the absolute limit. Factoring in the few lost decades for youth and old age, humans had perhaps 120 to 130 years of working achievement they could possibly call upon, while he had spent that long on this carving alone. However, as he watched, the human activated an incredibly tiny screen on their wrist, creating a faint blue glowing rectangle suspended in the air in front of them. From here, both the rectangle's images and the human's limbs became a blur of motion as the human began searching for whatever they were looking for. But it was only a span of a few heartbeats later that the human seemed to settle on something. Reaching over to the glowing suspended rectangle of light again, the human made a gesture and abruptly the image expanded, ballooning until it was nearly the height and width of Karras' own immense body. The figure was a carving, a man, his face turned slightly. The muscles and detail were perfect, or at least as perfect as Karras could tell. Alongside the image were several zoomed-in close-up shots of various details across the piece, and with each one Karras felt more and more lightheaded. But it was the final close-up that truly took his breath away. It was of the carved figure's hand clutching a sheet of fabric that bulged and hung exactly like fabric should, rendered with exquisite detail. It was a technique that Karras himself hoped to one day capture, as only one of the master carvers he had apprenticed under had ever managed to achieve such a feat of precision, expression and carving mastery. The sun had begun to rise the next morning when he finally snapped out of his momentary shock and uncertainly asked, "And this was from just a normal human, with a normal human lifespan?" The artificial voice filtered back. "This? Yes, just a normal human. Most consider him a master sculptor, and he's part of a group colloquially called the Old Masters." Karras did his best to seem nonchalant, as he asked exactly how old this Old Master was, but he could feel a release of tension within his chest, as the human replied that the original was something called an Italian, from approximately 2,000 years earlier. Doing his best to avoid being rude, Karras stated, Well, 2 millennia is certainly a fast turnaround time for both gaining skill and producing such work, but the skill is to be commended regardless." The human responded with more of the chittering sounds before the voice came back. "Oh, I'm sorry, you misunderstand. The artist, the Italian who made the original, died at 88 years of age." Karras felt like someone had just kicked half his legs out from under him. "Less than a century? Less than a century and they produce that? There's not a blemish on it. And you say he produces even with him working so far into his old age?" Again, more of the strange chittering sounds, and the humans replied, "Oh, sorry, you misunderstand. That was when he passed away. He carved the piece, the inspiration, when he was a mere 26 years old." Karras felt something akin to nausea from the mountain of impossibility that was producing mastery that took 1,000,000 years in a quarter of a century. Less than that, even, if one considered that human morphology and strength would likely not permit carving such works until a decade or more into their life. It was astonishing, and yet it still brought a tear to Karras' eye as he mourned for a human he had never met, who had such beauty and exquisite expression. He had only decades to learn, less than a century to live. Imagine what he could do with an epoch. What sublime perfections could he coax forth unto the birth, life and death of a star? Karras closed his eyes, taking a deep breath to try and calm himself. He opened them, giving the humans in the moonlight a small smile. "It is a shame that he lives so..." He paused, mentally adjusting to the human frame of reference for time spans. "Long ago, as I would have liked to have studied as his apprentice." "Well," said the human after a brief burst of discussion, "it's certainly not the only piece of his that we have, nor the only record of his life. He was born well after the advent of writing and written records. Many of those lessons and his knowledge have not been truly lost." Karras' eyes widened in shock. In his astonishment he asked, "Might I have a chance to read through them?" "Of course," said the human, displaying bared teeth despite what was clearly meant to be a smile, "on the condition that any lessons you learn, you are willing to teach the next generation as well." Karras nodded, and after patiently transferring the information to his own terminal, he opened up the file on the glowing green monitor and began to read. The initial books and documents he had been given took him a year to complete, an eye blink and drip of nourishment when he hungered for so much more. But then he had reached out, and the humans, now staunch and friendly allies, all miscommunications having been resolved or averted, gladly sent him orders of magnitude more. These, in turn, took several decades to read, still a mere trickle, before he had scraped the bottom, finding the end to all of what humans had written upon the long-dead sculptor. Every work had been committed to memory, every piece of sculpture and painting, analysed and appraised. And if Karras were being honest with himself, all excuses having been exhausted. Finally, he turned back to his block of marble. He had left the comfortable ease of soapstone behind, as he wished to truly challenge himself and prove he was up to the challenge accomplished by a mere human. When he had asked that first human how they did it, doing and creating and living so much in so little time, the human had just smiled and told him, "We are blessed in that the candle that burns half as long burns twice as bright." Karras planned for nearly 5 years, but he was still working at a breakneck pace compared to the leisurely centuries he had taken before. And so, with a confidence and exhilaration he had never felt while crafting before, he gathered his chisel and hammer. He too could see the angel in the marble, and now he just had to carve until he set it free.